Hey guys, this is going to be a little bit of a weird video, I realize, but I think it's going to be an interesting video to maybe give you guys a little bit of an insight as to what I do. So, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I probably listen to, would probably guess 8 hours of podcasts every day. Whether it's, I do use Stitcher quite a bit. There's a new podcast app out called Himalaya that I think is very interesting looking. I haven't messed with it too much, but I use Podcast Addict to listen to most of my podcasts. And I want to share with you guys the screenshots from Podcast Addict and tell you guys the podcasts I listen to and what I like. They're not all FBA or business related. So there will be a couple off this list that I just need to update. So one of them is called I Only Listen to the Mountain Goats. Unfortunately, that one's over. The Mountain Goats is a band. I don't know how to describe them. If you want to get a feel for them, look up the song No Children by the Mountain Goats. It's been a very important band in my life since about 2003. I Only Listen to the Mountain Goats is a really cool podcast where they sit down with the founder or the guy that basically is the band and interview him. If you are familiar with the podcast, this is my I Only Listen to the podcast, or the I Only Listen to the Mountain Goats vinyl, which is really cool. I actually bought music that I heard in a podcast. Very strange. Another big omission on this list would be Serial. If you've never listened to Serial, I would definitely recommend it. I think that if you know somebody that is on the fence about whether or not they like podcasts, the first season of Serial where that guy, or I don't know exactly what happened, but that girl got murdered. Fascinating. So let's go through what I do have on here, and I'll explain each and every one of them because they're not all business podcasts. A lot of times when people share like, oh, this is the podcast I listen to every day, it's all business podcasts. I don't just listen to business podcasts. That would get so boring. So first, 99% Invisible. 99% Invisible is a reference to a quote by Buckminster Fuller where he said that good design is 99% invisible. The host of that, Roman Mars, just really cool. They talk about designs and design solutions to everyday problems. It can be all sorts of stuff. Okay, they did a whole episode about like the tunnels that are in New York. Like, I don't know, a lot of people know this, but under Brooklyn, New York, they used to have these cattle tunnels because there used to be big butchers or butcheries and meat packing places. They'd have the ships come in and unload cows under the city. Really cool. They talk about all sorts of cool stuff and how design can solve problems. Very interesting. Next up is Affirmative Murder. Maybe not everybody realizes this, but I'm a huge fan of true crime. Affirmative Murder is it's actually about minorities that commit murder, which actually on its face sounds really racist. But most podcasts that are like about serial killers, they kind of just equal opportunity. But these guys actually focus on like female serial killers, African American serial killers. It's really interesting. The two guys that make it, they're from Baltimore. They're real casual with it. If you like true crime, I'd recommend it. Not for everybody, but I like it. Now, next up is All Fantasy Everything. I love this podcast. I've actually met some of the people on the podcast. Basically, they draft everyday things into fantasy drafts. So they do like a top five. They did one that was like top 5 things to order from Taco Bell, top 5 things to order from, or like top 5 animals you would want to domesticate. It's real funny. Love it. Lighthearted. Absolutely love it. Next is Bear Brook. That is another podcast that is about true crime. That murder, I believe it happened in New Hampshire. It was one of the first cases where they used DNA to identify somebody that was not identified. And in this case, it was actually a living person. It was a woman that was the victim of kidnapping as a child, did not know her identity. They were actually able to reunite her with her family. If you're familiar with true crime, the case is referred to very frequently as the bodies in the barrels case. And that is, Bear Brook is like an 8-hour or so podcast about that one case. Very interesting. Now, Business Wars, I've fallen in love with. It's from Wonderly. I heard about them with Dr. Death, and they talked about Business Wars. Really love this podcast. I did they're just now doing Burger King versus McDonald's. They did a really cool thing about like Netflix versus HBO versus Blockbuster. Okay. And I learned a lot about that. And, you know, when businesses refuse to grow with the trends, it's problematic. Okay. So definitely check that one out. That is a business podcast. This is actually the first true business podcast of my first 5 podcasts. So definitely check it out. It is very interesting and entertaining. Chris D'Elia, just one of my favorite comedians. His podcast is hilarious. Love listening to him. Nothing more I can say. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. I like this. I don't know how much I like it, to be honest. There's definitely some very interesting subjects. It's very well researched. His pace can be a little bit off sometimes, but I like it. Overall, I like it. I feel that his pace could be a little bit better, but that's nitpicky. Doug Loves Movies. If you guys love a good comedy podcast, Doug Loves Movies is excellent. I would also recommend getting Doug with High. That's not on this list that I listen to through Stitcher. Doug Loves Movies is a podcast about movies that you don't even really need to like movies to be entertained by. I got to find one of my favorite comedians ever is Todd Glass, and I found him through Doug Loves Movies and also the Preston and Steve podcast, which is we'll see later. Dr. Death, next one is a kind of true crime podcast. It's about a neurologist that's incompetent. It's a true story. I believe he ended up killing 3 people in 3 years and paralyzed most of his patients as he was doing spinal surgery on them. Get into true crime, or it's true. So I would recommend, if you're going to be doing any sort of surgery in the near future, don't listen to it. But other than that, very entertaining. So then we got Dumb People Town. If you guys aren't familiar with it, it's Randy Sklar and Dan Van Kirk. Very, very funny podcast. Very easy to get into. Love it. We got Funding the Dream. That's another business podcast about Kickstarter. Not a lot of people know this, or maybe everybody knows this, but I did Kickstarter one time for a jewelry product. I got like 336% funded or something like that. So it's pretty cool. I do like Kickstarter, and I've been thinking about doing more Kickstarters in the future. So, check it out. Harmontown, Dan Harmon, he's the guy behind Rick and Morty. This is his podcast. Very interesting, very funny. He's a funny guy. A little bit problematic, definitely a lot bit problematic, but I still do listen to it. Very interesting. History That Doesn't Suck, just another history podcast. I do love history, and this is definitely one of my favorite podcasts about it. How did this get made? You would think I was a film fan by these podcasts, but I'm really not. I like podcasts, but I don't love, I like movies, but I'm not like a huge movie buff. So it is funny how many podcasts I listen to about movies, but this is one of them, and this is more of a comedy thing. Basically, they watch a movie. They start with, how did this get made? Like, what was the process to get it made? And then they kind of talk about how ridiculous the movie is. They've done like really famous episodes with like The Room, if you've ever seen that. And they actually did an episode with The Room with Tommy Wiseau, which was very interesting. So that was good. Now, how I built this is, if you're in business, I definitely recommend this. They just did an episode with the guy that was the one of the co-founders of Southwest. Actually, it's an older episode, but they redid it. He just passed away last week, so they re-aired an older episode in commemoration of him. Very interesting guy, very interesting story to tell. And with that, they've talked to really amazing people. I would recommend 2 episodes if you want to get hooked. One is with Jim Koch, the founder of Sam Adams. The other is with Damian Johns, the founder of FUBU. Both of these are 2 guys that kind of came from nothing and built something very good to listen to. Okay. Idiot with Chris Hardwick, or ID 1012, or ID 10T. Very funny podcast. Definitely would recommend it. Interviews people. Real funny. Love it. Imaginary Worlds. I just got into that a couple months ago, and then it was really funny because it got referenced the other day on 99% Invisible. They did a whole episode on Magic the Gathering. Imaginary Worlds is about the worlds of fantasy, like card games and movies and stuff like that. Really, really cool stuff. They go pretty deep into things with like Warhammer lore and Cards Against Humanity and Dungeons and Dragons. Really awesome. Okay. And you don't have to be a big nerd or a big fan of these things to appreciate it, because storytelling is universal. Doesn't matter whether they're telling a story about Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. It's interesting. Definitely check it out. King Falls AM. This is an acquired taste. This is a podcast a lot of people may not like, or maybe do. It's a fantasy podcast. It's like roughly comedic. There's another podcast on here called Welcome to Night Vale, which is basically a radio show from a really weird area. That's the only way I can describe it. It's, of course, fictitious, but very entertaining. Then we got Last Podcast on the Left. I'm actually going to be seeing them this year. Very, very interesting. I love, you can tell so far, I love business, and I love true crime. I really love conspiracy theories. So they do a lot of like conspiracy theory stuff. They did a episode about like David Bowie was a wizard, and they're just doing a thing about this guy who was a serial killer. Well, he was an attempted serial killer from Canada who like made movies and stuff like that. Real crazy. He was inspired by Dexter. I forget the guy's exact name, but he very interesting. They just did a whole series on Temple of the Sun. I forget what it was. But it was like this death cult from Europe. Really, if you like weird esoteric stuff, Last Podcast on the Left, cannot recommend it enough. Very funny, very well done. Legion of Skanks. This one, if I have to put a parental advisory on any of my podcasts, it's this one. Okay, very funny, but really kind of fucked up. But very funny. Masters of Scale. Finally, we're back to a business podcast. This is really interesting. It's helped me with a perspective on a lot of things with my business. Some of it I've had some problems with implementing, just because my business is fairly small, but I've actually been able to implement some really good tips on this. This is a great business podcast to listen to. Mortified, I'm very disappointed they haven't released new episodes in a while, but the premise behind Mortified is people read their journal passages from when they were children. Very funny, very, very funny, and I would definitely recommend it. But unfortunately, there's no new episodes for a while. There also, I believe, is a documentary they did. Pretty entertaining. Okay, so then My Brother and Me, just another funny podcast, just pretty lighthearted discussion with 3 guys that are brothers. Just pretty funny podcast. Then we got My Favorite Murder. My Favorite Murder is a true crime podcast. Probably you can tell that. I would consider myself pretty much a murderino. If you're not familiar with the episode or with the podcast, that's kind of like what they call their friends. Very funny. not for everybody. It's a true crime comedy podcast. I'm actually going to see them in Pittsburgh this year. I'm very excited about it. Taking my employees on a road trip to see My Favorite Murder. So that'll be good. Then Punch Up the Jam. This is a weird podcast where they take a song and they critique it and they break it down and then they rewrite it. Not for everyone. They're not for children, definitely, but pretty funny. I like it. So next up, Radio Lab. That's another not a business podcast, but it's a more historic podcast. I don't know. They talk about all sorts of stuff. Very interesting subject matter. I've learned a lot from that podcast. I would definitely recommend it. It is one of my favorite podcasts. Unfortunately, they haven't been putting out new episodes lately, but whatever. So Radiolab More Perfect is about the Supreme Court, and they talk about really famous Supreme Court decisions, and that's been definitely like that podcast. I'm really into politics. I probably should listen to more political podcasts. Actually, I know that this didn't make it on here because I listened to it on Stitcher. Abe Lincoln's Top Hat is a very good political podcast. I know that there's a lot of political podcasts that are very slanted right-leaning or left-leaning. Abe Lincoln's Top Hat really, I feel, is very centrist. If you want to talk politics, they're both critical of Donald Trump and critical of Democrats and stuff like that. They're kind of equally critical of everyone. So it's really refreshing to hear, and that not on this list here. But Abe Lincoln's Top Hat, definitely recommended. It's where I get a lot of my political news from. So Reply All, just a good comedy podcast. And then this best related podcast, 3 episodes every week. Check that out. That's where I've learned a lot of, found a lot of podcasts. That's a good source to find new podcasts. Definitely recommend it. I forgot I do actually have Serial on here, so Serial, recommend it. I hope they have new episodes soon. One of my favorite podcasts. Spontaneousation or whatever. Another comedy podcast, very funny. Definitely recommend it. Stuff They Don't Want You to Know. Unfortunately, that one's kind of defunct now. But that was a really cool conspiracy theory podcast for a while. The How Stuff Works podcast is also very good, but I liked that one. I also liked How Stuff Works. Very interesting. Stuff You Missed in History Class. This is really cool. And again, I'm a huge history buff, and I like this format. I like a more informal format for history, a more conversational format. So that's one I definitely get a lot of listening to. The Cracked podcast, man. Cracked. If you ever thought that 10 years ago Cracked would be a news source, they ripped the I guess business model of BuzzFeed. They have a lot of top 10 fun facts about Rome, that kind of stuff. I was literally just listening to them, and they talked about myths about Rome and facts about Rome that people don't really talk. It's always funny when people talk about Rome, and I envision they talk about the invading Goths, and I always envision Robert Smith invading Rome, giant Robert Smiths just fighting Roman legions. I don't know why. I find it funny. The Dollop. The Dollop is also a American history podcast that's not always about American history. Very funny. Definitely recommend it. They just did an episode the other day about George H.W. Bush. They did one about John McCain. Very interesting, very well researched. Basically, it's 2 comedians. The one comedian writes a book report, like he's in high school, and reads it to the other book report, or the other comedian, and the other comedian's never read it. So it's very entertaining. They do a lot of improv within the podcast. Just really funny. Next is a podcast that I recommend to everyone. It's called The Dream. It's about multi-level marketing schemes, and it's fascinating. I would definitely recommend it to anybody that is considering an MLM. They investigate MLMs. They talk about what is an MLM, the history of MLMs. I'm pretty well versed in multi-level marketing just because I'm fascinated by it. I was actually just having a business meeting the other day with somebody, with one of my business partners, and we were looking at the marketing for quite a few MLMs and trying to take things from that marketing playbook and understand what they're hitting. You know, MLMs, basically, they promise you that anybody can be successful using them. Okay, and that's a famous line from the guy that founded Holiday Magic. If you know MLMs, you know what I'm talking about. It was one of the first MLMs to be sued by the I think it was the SEC or the FTC. I forget which one. So, and he basically said the only way to be unsuccessful is to be lazy or dead. And a lot of people believe that. They believe that if you work hard enough, you can get the American dream. And I mean, there's some truth to that, but there's also some untruth to that, you know. And let's be perfectly honest, you can't ditch dig your way to be a millionaire, okay? So you need to work smart, not hard all the time. But working hard and working smart, very beneficial. So a very interesting podcast. They actually set up accounts with some MLMs, and they actually go into it. They go into it with a bit of skepticism, but they really tried with a particular podcast, I believe, or a particular MLM. I believe it was Unique, and they actually really tried to make it work. They had one of their friends do it, and did not work that well, and they went into it. Very interesting podcast. So The Hilarious World of Depression, also a comedy podcast, very much like this one. If you think you're somebody that suffers from depression, I definitely listen to it. They interview famous people with depression, and it's very, very, it's a good listen, okay? Also, before I go to Joe Rogan, I will say there is another podcast off this list that's not on this list. I listened to it on another service called the Preston and Steve podcast. That's a radio station out of Philadelphia. It's a morning show. I've listened to them literally half my life, okay? I listened to them every morning when I was going to school. I'd have my FM radio, and I'd be standing at the bus stop listening to Preston and Steve. And just really, when I feel homesick, I listen to Preston and Steve, and I've listened to them for years. Very fun podcast. Maybe not for everybody, but I love them. So the Joe Rogan Experience. I really like the Joe Rogan Experience. I want to do more podcasts. I want to do more videos where I interview people. And I don't know how I feel about the Joe Rogan podcast all the time. Sometimes I feel like he's a bit much, but his interview style is very good. So you can't argue that. Also, another heavy hitter with good interview styles is the Tim Ferriss podcast. Tim Ferriss is excellent. The 4 Hour Work Week was a book that changed my life. And his podcast is just excellent. Absolutely love listening to it. Always do. And I recommend it to anybody that's interested in business in general. Okay. So, Todd Glass podcast, love him. I've actually seen him live several times, got to meet him and hang out with him. Very funny guy. He's from Philadelphia. He lives out in California now, though. Yeah, one of my favorite comedians. And the way his brain works is exactly the way my brain works, you know, and just that level of goofiness and just kind of like a wonder about the world, just to listen to just ADD personified as Todd Glass, and I love him. I'll tell you this, one of the funniest bits I've ever heard on the radio station was with Preston Steve. So they have Todd Glass on. Todd Glass is so ADD, and he's all over the place. So they hired a court stenographer to sit there and write down everything he says. So he starts talking, and he goes on rant, on rant, on rant, on rant. And then they pull back, and they're like, okay, well, this is how we got there. And like, it was amazing to him to actually have a court stenographer read back what he said. It was really funny. I would definitely recommend that. Todd Glass is just hilarious. So Trace Evidence is another podcast. I very much like it. If you like true crime, the pacing of Trace Evidence can be a little bit strange if you're not used to it. Also, you can tell I was just listening to it. They just were doing their episode about Matrice Richardson. If you're not familiar with the podcast or with that case, that case was a case where a woman was having mental problems. She was clearly having a psychotic episode, and she got arrested. She basically dined and dashed at a restaurant, got arrested, and then released by the police like 15 miles from her car with no money, no phone, no nothing. They just left her walk out, and she was clearly having a psychotic episode. And they unfortunately did find her body, and there's a big talk about a cover-up with it and stuff. Trace Evidence really examines the evidence of cases more than almost any podcast I've ever listened to. They really dive into the evidence and really talk about, why this is a conclusion, why this is a conclusion. Very, very interesting. True Crime Garage, that's another one. It's a two-person podcast about true crime. Really like that. It's not for everybody, but True Crime Garage, I definitely like. They try to be a little bit more comedic with talking about true crime, and that's definitely something that I very appreciate. And they've brought my attention to a lot of really interesting cases. So, I like that one. The NPR podcast, very self-explanatory. It's the news podcast. Love it. Also, I don't have on here Wait, Don't Tell Me. I listen to that quite a bit. There's a couple NPR, like Tiny Desk, I listen to a lot. Even if I don't like the music, the Tiny Desk podcast is really good. Then here is Welcome to Night Vale. If you're not familiar with Welcome to Night Vale, if you like good storytelling, just go listen to it. Go listen to there's a beginner's guide. It's not a continuous plot, so you can kind of pop in wherever, but I would definitely recommend listening to it if you like that stuff. It might not be for everyone. Then You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes. I love Pete Holmes. He's a very good comedian. I loved Crashing. I watched Crashing, his HBO show, at a time in my life where I really needed to watch Crashing, and it really helped me understand relationships and marriage and love and stuff like that. And I would really recommend it. He talks about it a lot in this podcast, and I would really recommend it. And then Your Mom's House with Tom Segura and his wife, Christina P. I'm out of focus now. I'm back in focus. Definitely not a family-friendly podcast. Definitely inappropriate. Definitely very funny. I'm actually going to see Tom Segura on Valentine's Day. It was funny. My employee and I, we listened to that at my warehouse, and my employee was teasing her husband. So it's going to be me and my employee Kate and her husband Chet, who I went and saw Tom Segura with before, but we're actually going to go and see the Your Mom's House. Or no, we went and saw, who did we see? We saw Doug Loves Movies. This is what's so crazy. Like with podcasts, we're actually going and seeing these podcasts be filmed. So far I've seen a Doug Loves Movies, and then Bert Kreischer's podcast, the Bertcast, which also is another one that I use Stitcher for. But we're going to go and see Tom Segura. He's not doing the Your Mom's House, but just doing stand-up. And I've already seen Tom Segura before. He was hilarious. And we were joking around because Kate and I are going, and her husband's coming. So it's going to be all three of us. And her husband just got a new job. So she was telling him, she's like, listen, if you don't get time off for this, Chris is going to be my Valentine. So, because we're going on Valentine's Day. So, that'll be real fun. Tom Segura is real funny. He's on Netflix. He has a special on Netflix. Very funny. His wife, Christina P., also has a Netflix special. Also extremely funny. So, yeah, check that out. So anyway, guys, listen, I know that this was kind of a weird video where I just went over the things I listen to every day, but it's actually something that I see people ask a lot of questions. You know, what podcast should I listen to? What podcast do you listen to? Well, there you go. These are the podcasts I listen to. I talked about them all pretty much and told you guys why I like them. So anyway, guys, I hope that this is helpful. I hope that this maybe brings you some entertainment, maybe opens your eyes to some things that you haven't been familiar with. I will tell you, if you are interested in true crime, Bear Brook is probably the best true crime podcast I've ever heard. So if you're on the fence about listening to true crime podcasts, or you're interested in, but you just like haven't like felt one that like really clicks with you, Bear Brook, that's the one to go to. Anyway, guys, talk to you later. I hope this was good. You have a wonderful night.